Hello once again, and thanks for joining us for this Sunday's edition of Alaska Weather. Up first on the hazardous weather graphics, there are no advisories, watches, or warnings out for the central southern interior, Kodiak Island, out to the west there, Bering Sea, or the Panhandle, even up to the north. No advisories, watches, or warnings all the way to the Arctic coast. High pressure controls much of Alaska. And then the storminess that's out west really isn't strong enough to produce anything in the way of public watches or warnings or advisories, but there are some gale warnings and storm warnings coming into the marine area, especially for the eastern Aleutians on Alaska Island on, Tuesday. So moving on to satellite imagery, nothing out there today that could even come close to producing storm force winds out over the Bering Sea or the Aleutians. You see just bands of thin bands of clouds there. One really dissipating, just mid and high level clouds there along Nunivak Island, St. Lawrence Island, back down across the Alaska Peninsula, and then another one from the Pribilofs to the Alaska Peninsula. That did produce a little bit of light rain down in that area. And then the heavier precipitation producing band there over the eastern Aleutians, and then kind of breaks out toward Adak and Atka today, especially Atka Island. May have seen some clearing. And then another weak system pushing in toward Shimi and Attu. Otherwise, interior Alaska, pretty clear and cold again today. Some low clouds, fog over Cook Inlet, maybe Prince William Sound, as well as some of the low valleys in the interior, but generally pretty clear conditions. Then you got some clouds coming down from the north around the Arctic on the Arctic coast there, and also some clouds are on the increase today in the Gulf of Alaska. And some of those snow showers moved into Kodiak Island, at least on the east side of the island today. Brought up to maybe half an inch of snow to some areas there. Temperatures in the mid-30s this afternoon or when the snow is falling, so pretty kind of wet snow, but it did work in there with that easterly flow off the Gulf and that moisture developing there as upper level trough comes down from the north. Really just some clouds on the eastern Arctic coast. There's another one up there that's coming southward. It doesn't show up on the surface map here because it's mostly aloft in the northerly flow aloft. Otherwise, strong high pressure centered now in the Yukon still extends westward, covering the northern Bering Sea, all of interior Alaska, with light wind conditions out along the Arctic coast today, with very slack gradient there, and then some channel gap north to northeast winds, Prince William Sound, Copper River Basin areas, and the North Gulf Coast. Nothing too terribly strong. Also gusty winds up to about 50 miles an hour, peak wind gusts at Eldred Rock, and that's about it. Really not blasting through the passes there as it could this time of the year, really lacking the upper support to do that. Out west, same pattern, rain, periods of there for the eastern Aleutians, lighter into the Alaska Peninsula area, and actually didn't even reach the Pribilofs today. Looking at the 24-hour rainfall amount, 0.8 of an inch, over 0.8 of an inch fell at Unalaska again. So that gave a weekend total for the eastern Aleutians there, Unalaska, Dutch Harbor, and Nikolsky, of about 2.5 inches of rain today, and or this weekend. Now today, Cold Bay picked up about 1/3 of an inch, and Adak had about 0.2 of an inch there with that weak low swinging into that area, and then the 1/2 inch of snow at Kodiak, give or take there, and that's about it as far as precipitation goes around the state. And winds not really much of a factor. Had some gusty winds over the Yukon Delta, east-northeast, 25 to 35 miles an hour, particularly around, St. Mary's. And for the weather for tonight, not much change out west, still unsettled. Couple of weakening frontal boundaries moving eastward. The first one falling apart, actually in place there now, just dissipates about where it is as it lies parallel to the wind flow from the southeast. So periods of light rain for the eastern Aleutians, maybe up to the Pribilofs. Western Alaska Peninsula, same thing, becomes more showery. Chance of snow showers, Kodiak Island. Chance of snow showers now for the southern Kenai Peninsula, and a little bit farther up into Prince William Sound, possibly could see some light snow shower conditions, maybe into Passage Canal, possibly Whittier. Probably won't jump the pass there and get into Turning an Arm, but North Gulf Coast, Cordova, could see a little bit of light snow, maybe a few snow showers in the North Gulf Coast range. Otherwise, no change for the southeast coast. Cold temperatures and channeled outflow winds continue with that high right over western Canada and the Northwest Territories now. And then a weak disturbance again coming southward onto the eastern Arctic coast brings a little bit of light snow to that area. And that actually shows up at the surface a little better now as 1,038 millibar low, but that'll produce areas of light snow. Fog and flurries keep the temperatures up from what they otherwise would be if the skies were clear with the light wind conditions. Could get a little bit of a west-southwest breeze, but nothing too significant. And high pressure holds over the Yukon, and no change for the southeast coast. Still a chance of snow showers for the North Gulf Coast, Kenai Peninsula, east side of Kodiak Island. No change out west. Frontal boundary pushes eastward and starts to kick the winds up a little bit there for the eastern Aleutians. Then another low comes up northward, develops down off the map there. Along that frontal boundary, there's a low south of the eastern Aleutians that comes northward. And again, as that comes up, that's forecast to bring storm force winds to Unalaska Island, gales to Unimak Island, and also good gales into the Alaska Peninsula during the day with good shot of rain into those areas. Rain and snow for the Pribilofs, rain and snow showers for the western Aleutians. Now a better chance of snow for the North Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound, and that could get into eastern Turnagain Arm, maybe some light snow as far west as Girdwood, but maybe into the Copper River Basin could see some light snow as well. Otherwise, the Panhandle, that strong offshore flow with a strong high over Canada, just keeps that off to the west there. And just some variable clouds, cold temperatures over much interior Alaska, not much change. Cold air locked in over the northern Bering Sea with east to northeast winds there. And for lows tonight, 5 below to 5 above for the northern Panhandle, otherwise single numbers and teens elsewhere. 30 to 40 below the Copper River Basin, Kuskokwim Valley, and 5 to 15 below South Central Alaska, Anchorage, Kenai, Soldotna, Cooper Landing, Sterling, those areas below 0 tonight. Seward down to about 10, near 30 for Kodiak, 0 to 5 for the for Bristol Bay. And for the highs, Bristol Bay 10 to 15, well below 0, Kuskokwim Valley, Copper River Basin, 0 to 10, call it for South Central Alaska. Some areas staying below 0, especially in the Susitna Valley and around Butte, up to possibly Palmer, more likely Butte there in the shaded areas. Lower 20s for Homer, and quite cold in the Panhandle, near 10 in the north to mid to upper teens down south. Lows 35 to 45 below in the Copper River Basin, and 25 to 35 below for the Kuskokwim Valley, 5 to 20 below South Central Alaska, upper 20s Kodiak Island, followed by highs very cold in the Panhandle, still highs of single numbers in the north, and 15 to 20 elsewhere, and maybe 25 to 30 below for the Copper River Basin for your highs, and 10 to 25 below for the Kuskokwim Valley, mid-30s Kodiak Island, and 5 below to 5 above South Central Alaska. Up to the north, lows tonight about like you've seen for the last couple of nights, all the way to the Arctic coast and out to the west. Highs tomorrow about like you've seen today, 20s and 30s below in the west. And some areas staying in the minus 40s, like Chicken today at mid-afternoon was 45 degrees below 0, while Adak was 45 above. Otherwise, milder out towards St. Lawrence Island. Lows Tuesday morning, about the same, 35 to 55 below 0 in the eastern interior. And highs in the well below 0 in the east, and in the teens for the Seward Peninsula, mid-20s St. Lawrence Island. Southwest coast 5 to 10 for the lows tonight, otherwise upper 30s to lower 40s for the Aleutians. Highs tomorrow 40 for the Pribilofs, lower to mid-40s for the central eastern Aleutians, lower 40s Alaska Peninsula, followed by lows Tuesday morning 0 to 10 for the southwest coast, mid-30s for the Pribilofs, near 40 for the eastern Aleutians, otherwise in the 30s, followed by highs 40 to 45, most areas upper 30s for the Pribilof Islands, and the southwest coast 5 to 15.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Down to flying weather, pretty good over the interior with some, in the Gulf of Alaska, that developing weak system there, spreading some IFR up to the Cape St. Elias area, marginal VFR in and around Cordova, maybe southern Prince William Sound. More extensive, though, eastern Fognak Kodiak Islands. Area of IFR out over the central Bering Sea, St. Matthew Island, Pribilofs to about AKwx eastward to the western Alaska Peninsula. Then the disturbance dropping down from the Arctic, bringing some IFR to the eastern Arctic coast, and then some low crud in the Yukon or Porcupine River area, producing some IFR. And for the afternoon, that holds there along the Porcupine Yukon River over the flats. IFR more extensive now, that moisture dropping southward again from the Arctic and the northerly flow. IFR eastern Arctic coast right down to the eastern North Slope. And the interior stays pretty nice. Marginal VFR now into Resurrection Bay, not quite into Passage Canal, but pushing into southern Cook Inlet, North Gulf Coast. Stays VFR for the Panhandle, Southwest Coast VFR. Kodiak Island mostly VFR, Fognak Island marginal, and then that area of IFR out over the central Bering Sea. And that sort of compresses a little on Tuesday. Now the Pribilof St. Matthew Island marginal, IFR eastern Aleutians to AKwx, and then improving to the west, improving to the east. Interior looking pretty good, although increasing IFR north of the Brooks Range out to the Arctic coast. And IFR mostly staying off the North Gulf Coast there and well west of the Panhandle. For Tuesday afternoon, that IFR now makes a move right up to the eastern Arctic coast into Yakutat and probably marginal for Cordova there, but Panhandle staying VFR. And marginal VFR, Kodiak Fognak Island on up to Montague Island, and some IFR along the North Slope to the eastern Arctic coast. IFR also oriented northwest to southeast there across the Bering Sea to the eastern Aleutians. Passes, Anaktuvik, VFR. Adigan, though, might see some marginal VFR, especially on the northern entrance. Lake Clark and Merrill, another VFR day coming up for those two passes. Rainy, same forecast. Good VFR again on Monday. Windy, Monday looking really good for flying through the pass. Good VFR. Isabel, same forecast, VFR. And Mentasta, VFR. Tanita, also VFR. Portage, another VFR day. Either pass or either approach entrance, and same thing for Chilkoot and White, VFR, both north and south entrances and through the pass. Freezing levels, North Gulf Coast, the surface along the North Gulf Coast, but still west of the Panhandle, and then right along the southwest coast, 2,000 feet southerly flow there, pushing 4,000 feet all the way up into the Russian coastline there, 2,000 feet just north of St. Lawrence Island. And as far as icing goes, increasing moisture there, Gulf of Alaska, could produce some areas of increased potential for some light icing there for the North Gulf Coast, maybe Prince William Sound, but it'll be on the light side, may actually be a little bit farther to the south, stay a little more offshore than that shows. And then some bands of icing out over the Bering Sea and Aleutians, isolated to very isolated moderate, mostly light rime icing, western Alaska Peninsula. And for the jet stream, upper level ridging right along the eastern Bering Sea there, kind of northwest to southeast, with northerly flow 65 to 85 knots in the interior, and southerly flow to the west 65 to 80 knots around that upper low south of the Komodorskis. And for 9,000 feet, low pressure dropping southward to the Kenai Peninsula tomorrow. That's what's increasing that moisture over the Gulf of Alaska. And then the southerly flow there, 45 knots, trying to pull it northward to the coastline. And then that drops off considerably there, crossing the coast range, but back to the west, over the western interior, north to northeast winds, 40 to 50 knots, southeast, 50 to 60 knots across the central Bering Sea. And to 3,000 feet, Bering Sea, south-southeast, 55 to 60 knots there, just along and west of the Pribilofs to the eastern Aleutians, and 55-knot southeast winds along the North Gulf Coast. Turbulence, moderate turbulence there for the North Gulf Coast, southwest interior, Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutians, possibly St. Lawrence Island, and from Amchitka to Shemya.
Welcome back to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder, and joining us once again is Eric Stevens, our good friend from GINA, the Geographic Information Network of Alaska, based up at UAF. And thanks for joining us, Eric. Really appreciate it.
Oh, happy to be here, Dave.
And we love to hear about all the fascinating developments, new and old, and how we're using the tools here, especially around Alaska. And I've got to think that, you know, satellite meteorology right now is a fascinating time to be involved in. If we go back to the first satellite, Tyros, back in 1960, I think is when we got some of those first pictures. Weather and meteorology probably changed that day for a whole lot of people, and it's still changing today, right?
Oh, you know it. Satellite imagery is so important, and it's getting better all the time. Yeah. Of course, never perfect, but especially for us in Alaska, where there are other data sets like radars and weather balloons are so thinly spread. Right. The satellite is the great equalizer because the satellite sees everything.
Right.
Yeah. Right. We've got one particular issue in volcanic ash detection.
That's a big deal here. Yeah.
You know it. If you fly an airplane into volcanic ash, your jet engine might just fail. And an airplane without engines is in a world of hurt.
Sure.
So if there's a volcano that goes off, satellite imagery is the way to track that plume of ash and to tell pilots this is where you need to not be to avoid this ash plume. And there's a phrase out there, what's the difference? What's the difference?
Okay.
Well, it turns out, what we're going to discuss today, that the difference is everything. There's a technique called channel differencing.
Okay.
That if you take one piece of the spectrum of what the satellite detects and a slightly different wavelength of that spectrum, even though those two images might look similar, magical things happen when you subtract one from the other, and they reveal information that was already there, but it was hard to find until you did that subtraction.
This sounds like Nicolas Cage in National Treasure when he's got those fancy glasses and he's flipping one up and back and forth. I mean, is this what we're talking about?
Well, let's go more highbrow and talk Michelangelo.
Oh,
so apparently Michelangelo made some amazing sculpture, and someone said, Michael, that's amazing. How did you do it? And Michelangelo's reply allegedly was, well, you know, in that rock, the statue was already in there.
Right.
I just scraped away the unnecessary bits. In satellite meteorology, sometimes there are meteorological features that are in the data, but you can't see it until you combine or difference some of the channels.
Okay.
And we've got a case, good old Pavlov volcano goes off now and then.
Sure.
And you can observe directly a picture of the volcano. You know, just take it with your iPhone. You can see a volcano going off.
Yep.
Right. But if you want to get the broad view, we need satellite to do that. Now, there are a couple of wavelengths that we can look at. So what's a wavelength? That's the amount of space between a peak and a valley and another peak in a certain part of the electromagnetic spectrum. We're going to look at 12 micron wavelength and 10.8 micron wavelength.
What is a micron?
So what's a micron? Yeah, we're getting into the geek department now. A micron is a unit of length, and it is quite tiny. We're looking at what's called long wave wavelengths.
Okay.
But it takes 25,000 of these microns to make an inch. A human blood cell is about 5 microns across. So when we're talking about 12 micron imagery as allegedly long wave, well, that's relative.
Pretty short for light.
Yeah, it's other part of the, it's just an expression for the spectrum there.
Okay.
So we can look at a 12 micron image, say a satellite image. At 12 microns, we're seeing a heat signature here, really, and the way this color enhancement works is the yellow and the red stuff is high cold clouds down here over the Gulf of Alaska into South Central. And if you were asked, where do you find the volcanic ash plume in this image?
Hey, where do you find the volcanic plume in this image?
It's hard to do. I'm not sure I could find it. If you were to look at this image and just say, show me what jumps out at you here, I'd say, well, nothing really. Well, let's look. So 12 micron doesn't help us. Let's look at 10.8 microns.
All right.
All right, look at that. It's practically the same image. So where's this volcanic ash? Can't find it at 12 microns, can't really see it at 10.8, but when we subtract one channel from the other, magically the plume appears. The color enhancement here highlights the ash in blue.
Wow.
The information was already there, but we couldn't find it until we subtracted one channel from another.
Very interesting.
It's almost magical. Similarly, let's say you're looking for fog up on the North Slope. It's kind of a foggy neighborhood.
Sure.
in 11 micron and 3.9 micron. We've got a 3.9 micron image here. It's a big fuzzy blur over Barrow. We can't see where the fog is. But the information is lurking in there waiting for us to reveal it. All we have to do is find that difference between the 11 micron and the 3.9, and then this image becomes this image, and the fog bank jumps right out, and you can see it up there at Barrow. Now, you got to choose the right tool for the job.
Sure.
Like they say, you open your toolbox, all kinds of stuff in there. What do we need for this particular task? If you want to find volcanic ash, we look at 12 and 10.8 micron, find that difference. If you want to find fog, we'll look at 11 and 3.9 micron, find that difference. It's great, different tools for different jobs. Of course, there's always caveats and gotchas, but this fog procedure, it only works at night, because when the sun comes up, it gets in the way. So every product has its strengths and limitations, and in meteorology, the challenge is using the right tool for the right job, and these are some of those tools.
And discovery is still happening, even with meteorology. The weather's been around for a long time, but the tools that are being developed to understand the meteorology is fascinating and still very new science.
It's such a young science. We've come so far. I'm getting old enough now that I can literally say that, when I was a boy, we didn't have this kind of thing. And there's new things happening all the time. New satellites will be launched in coming years that will have better instruments than ever before. It's an exciting time, and this is so helpful for Alaska because satellites help fill in the gaps between other ways of observing the weather. Satellites, the great equalizer for Alaska.
Yeah, and help so many people stay safe in so many ways every day up here in the last frontier.
Yeah, that's what it's all about, protecting lives and property.
Well, thank you so much for joining us again, Eric. We love to hear about this fascinating information, and boy, it just makes me want to go watch satellite pictures all day. So hopefully we're inspiring more people to do the same thing, and just be curious. It's a wonderful thing. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts, and we'll see you next time.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Today's sea ice analysis showing the area there north of the Bering Strait pretty much iced over now for all purposes there. And then taking a look down the coast to the southwest coast, you can see it continuing to expand westward with those easterly winds, and now linked up there, St. Lawrence Island, to the area near Norton Sound, at least with some thinner ice. Ice continuing to expand there along the Kuskokwim Delta coast, also in the northeast Bristol Bay, and Cook Inlet has some heavier ice now south of the Forelands. For the coastal water forecast, east winds 20 knots for the south coast of the Panhandle, east 25 to 30 knots with 12-foot seas on the north coast. Lynn Canal, north winds 30 knots, seas 8 feet. And Stevens Passage, north at 25. Clarence Strait, north winds 15 knots, seas 4 feet. For Tuesday, east winds at 20 knots in the south coast, seas at about 10 feet, small craft advisories for the north coast. Southeast at 25, seas 12 to 13 feet. And lighter winds now for Lynn Canal, north 30 knots, seas 6 feet, northeast 25 knot winds. For the central inside waters and Clarence Strait, winds will be southeast to 20 knots. Prince William Sound, looking at small craft advisories for Monday, northeast winds 25 knots, seas at about 4 feet. And for the North Gulf Coast, northeast winds 30 to 35 knots with 7 to 8 foot seas. Barren Islands, northeast winds 25 knots, and southern Cook Inlet and Kamishak Bay, northeast winds 30 knots, seas 7 feet. Northern Cook Inlet, northeast at 15. And for Tuesday, not much change for Cook Inlet. Northern Cook Inlet, northeast at 15. Kamishak Bay and southern Cook Inlet, northeast at 30. Northeast winds 20 knots for the Barren Islands, and small craft advisories for the North Gulf Coast. There around Middleton Island, looking at southeast winds 30 knots. Western North Gulf Coast, northeast at 25. Prince William Sound, northeast winds 20 knots, seas 4 feet. Kodiak Island on Monday, northeast winds 20 to 30 knots. Alaska Peninsula east winds at 30 knots, and Bristol Bay northeast winds 25 knots with 5-foot seas. And then with that next front pushing eastward there toward the eastern Aleutians and actually passing Unalaska Island late in the afternoon, big increase in the winds for the peninsula there, east at 45 knots, and gale warnings for Bristol Bay, northeast 35 knot winds. Kodiak Island winds will be northeast at 30 knots. And moving out west there, western Aleutians, south winds 25 to 30 knots. Central Aleutians, much lighter, south to southeast at 15 knots with 8 to 10 foot seas. And then for the Fox Islands, east-southeast winds 20 to 35 knots with seas running 8 to 11 feet. And then we've got storm warnings out for Unalaska Island on Tuesday until that front pushes through late in the day for east winds of 50 knots. Otherwise, Unimak Island, east-southeast winds 30 to 40 knots. Central Aleutians, 20-knot winds. And for the western Aleutians, north at 20 knots, but seas still up around 20 feet. For the southwest coast, excuse me, east winds 30 knots, and east gale warnings for the Pribilof Islands, St. Matthew Island, east winds at 35 to 40 knots, and also gale warnings for St. Lawrence Island for east winds at 35 knots with 10-foot seas. And for Tuesday, St. Lawrence Island, east winds 30 knots, and the southwest coast, gale warnings on Tuesday, east winds 35 to 40 knots, and storm warnings for the Pribilof Islands and St. Matthew Island for northeast winds 50 to 55 knots with seas 23 to 25 feet. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast, west-southwest breeze at 10 knots for the day Monday, north at 10 for the central coast, western Arctic coast, east-southeast winds 10 to 15 knots, and east winds at 20 knots from Wells to Cape Thompson. And northeast winds, 20 knots, Wells to Cape Thompson, western Arctic coast, east-northeast winds 20 to 25 knots. And for the central coast, northeast at 15, eastern Beaufort Sea coast, north to northeast 10 to 15 knots Tuesday. For tonight, maybe a few flurries for the eastern Arctic coast there with a weak trough, and then it stays wet and windy, not much change occurring over the Bering Sea, as well as the interior. North Gulf Coast seeing an increased chance of snow showers later tonight, maybe the southern Kenai Peninsula, Kodiak Island, already seen them. That'll continue tonight. No change for the Panhandle. For tomorrow, about the same as today. And Tuesday, better chance for snow, North Gulf Coast into the Copper River Basin. Otherwise, not much change elsewhere.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.